I'd now like to introduce briefly our next speaker, Professor Shayegan, who I think is not a stranger to many in this room or probably online either. I have the really distinct pleasure of being colleagues with Professor Shayegan here at UCLA, where he's a professor in Near Eastern languages and cultures, and also the founding director of the Port-Aviv Now Institute for the Study of the Iranian World, to name just two of the many hats that he wears on campus. His scholarship, which is at once very philological and also profoundly historical, has done a tremendous amount in the last decades to push the discipline of ancient Iranian history and thought about the ancient Iranian world forward. And in this, I would mention specifically his 2011 book, Arsacids and Sasanians, Political Ideology in Post-Hellenistic and Late Antique Persia. Professor Shayegan is truly a driving force behind the continued strength and actually the dynamic expansion of UCLA's program in Iranian studies, which has a long and very proud tradition here in this most Iranian of cities in the United States. And beyond being a tremendously kind and generous colleague and a dedicated mentor to our graduate students, he will also be gracing us today with a talk, The Achaemenids and the Ordered Universe of Ahuramazdā. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this very generous introduction. I am placeholder for all Iranists unwilling or incapable to speak about Bible in its Achaemenid context. So thank you so much for indulging me. While surveying the empire of ancient Iran, one cannot but wonder at the paucity of testimonies that attest to their presence in history. Relatively few written documents bear witness to the religious thought, literature, scientific spirit, legal codices, and administrative infrastructure of the Achaemenids. Less abundant are also the remnants of the material world. The imperial art of ancient Iran and extant architectural remains are more elusive, in contrast to the abundance displayed in rival empires. Traditionally, this thrift of testimonies has been ascribed to the misfortunes and devastations that befell the Iranian empires in the wake of sudden collapse or the ravages inflicted by conquerors. Although there is so much to recommend this assumption, it is nonetheless legitimate to query whether the very essence of Iranian imperial power was more discreet, its touch subtler, its global imprint more lissome, and thus in want of a more pertinent scrutiny. The question surely is not whether the grand empires of ancient Iran, among them the Achaemenids, erected palaces, built cities. Thank you. The question surely is not whether the grand empires of ancient Iran erected palaces, built cities, or produced literary canons, but whether or not the very nature of Iranian dominion and its notion of empire was ever bent on impressing on territories under its rule a uniform cultural imprint that would have generated a more cohesive body of cultural artifacts throughout their domains, or whether it followed a radically different path, permitting cultural individuation at the expense of rendering the task of discerning its imprint more exacting to us. Allow me briefly to elaborate on this by providing some context. One of the cardinal questions in Achaemenid studies is concerned with how the Achaemenid Empire shaped its religious landscape, or whether one may speak of an Achaemenid policy in religious matters that was distinctly at odds with the state of affairs in prior empires of Mesopotamia, and was characterized by the willingness of the central authority to afford limited autonomy in religious practices to the empire's heterogeneous constituents. Or what is more, whether beyond this perceived permissiveness, the empire was even supportive of local cultural practices by economically sustaining them or even assertively regulating their rituals. Many examples have been discussed in the past to make a case of an Achaemenid religious policy that could, as a matter of state doctrine, facilitate local religious or cultural practices, especially around the so-called Reichsautorisation, which was vigorously discussed among biblical scholars in the past decades before much of the evidence was dismissed from Iranist quarters, some justifiably and some, in my opinion, prematurely. This dossier we shall, by the grace of Ahuramazdā, not be able to approach today. Instead, I would like to turn our attention to other documentation which have been investigated in recent time and which may evince sufficient evidence to elucidate the relation between empire and local cultural practices within the Achaemenid realm. Although the Persians of old, and that is for Jina specifically, continued the imperial traditions of Assyrians, Babylonians, and other cuneiform cultures such as the Elamites, theirs was a distinct religious world, shaped partially by the Indo-Iranian heritage, as reflected in the Achaemenid royal inscriptions. In a nutshell, the epigraphic material conveys the following picture as to the exalted position of Ahuramazdā and his synergy with the great king. Ahuramazdā is represented as the greatest of gods, Mathishta Bagaram, who has set the cosmos in motion and regulated the world through his order. Distinct was also how the Achaemenids treated the divinities of their subjects. Their predecessors, the Assyrians and Babylonians, would have often carried off the statues of the gods of vanquished enemies, rendered the sanctuary desolate, in which the Persians also were pretty good at, and seat the divine emblems of hostages in the temples of their own victorious gods, Ashur or Marduk among others, so that even within the realm of the sacred, the subjugation of their foes to their new lords would be manifest. The Persians usually shunned these practices. To the contrary, they would embrace the divinities of their subjects as a mean to evince legitimacy from among the autochthonous elites and populace. But if the Persians didn't carry off the statues of vanquished gods, didn't impress upon their subjects their own notion of the divine, how did they translate the political dominion into the realm of the sacred? It seems that theirs was a subtle form of cultural imprint that demands further scrutiny. The Persian or Achaemenid approach towards extraneous theologies and practices was one of orderly arrangement. This means that rather than carrying off the gods of the conquered, for this then to endure the ascendancy of the Iranian pantheon, the Achaemenids would resort to structuring, arranging the subjects' religious practices, rituals, laws, and even pantheon, as if this ordering was reminiscent of the reenactment of an original act of creation by the supreme god, Ahuramazdā, who had set the cosmos in motion by ordering it. This ordering could take different forms. But first, allow me a digression into the Achaemenid inscriptions in search of an elusive order, or arta, before looking for its material realization. Intriguingly, the concept of order, although functionally ever present in the Achaemenid inscriptions, in the very act of Ahuramazda's establishing the cosmos, does, however, rarely occur in an explicit manner as an overarching principle, as it frequently does in the garb of Asha in the Avesta. Here we see in the Avesta the notion of order in its older Western garb, Asha, being created by Ahuramazdā next to the primal cow, which is the gum. Intriguingly, so in Xerxes' inscription, which is the famous Daiva inscription to which my colleague just referred, Dr. Moore, we find probably the most explicit reference to Arta as an organizing principle. Therein, a parallelism has been created between, on the one hand, the happiness of man, which translates into him following the law set down by Ahuramazdā in the material world, and on the other hand, the blessedness of man, namely his becoming a follower of order, Artavan, when dead, which requires man sacrificing to Ahuramazdā in accordance with the cosmic order fashioned in the height. This inscription also admonishes men not to leave the right path, which is the Pathitaya Rasta, established by Ahuramazdā. We come back on these inscriptions in a moment. O man, may the command of Ahuramazdā not deem foul to you. Do not leave the straight path. Do not oppose it. Intriguingly, this right path is also known from the Avesta as the one leading up to order for the followers of order, Achaemenid. And it says, may you grant those the seeking and finding of the straightest path, which is the straightest path up to order, the best existence of the followers of order. What does all this nonsense mean? Simply put, happiness or harmony with order, cosmic order, is gained in the material world, in the phenomenal world, by following Ahuramazda's law. In addition, however, those who also correctly sacrifice to Ahuramazdā while alive shall progress onto the right path that leads to order and will eventually be blessed in afterlife as followers of order, one with order. What about the king's law that holds in orderly fashion the empire's diverse constituents and infuses fear in the heart of its subjects? What about that law? Says King Darius, by the greatness of Ahuramazdā, I ruled over these lands which I seized further away from Persia. They, these lands, bore me tribute. They did whatever was told to them by me. My law, it's a long A, held them in place. How does this law relate to the one that Ahuramazdā belongs to Ahuramazdā? And where does the king's law fit into the fabric of order? Phenomenological or transcendental? It seemed that a scanty notice tripartite structures. Well, one more time. It seems that the scanty notice tripartite structure governs the distribution of these ordering principles. Whereas the law of Ahuramazdā, which is said to be set, nishtaya, regulates in the material world the ethics of the Mazdean man, the Homo Mazdeanus, as well as his orderly sacrifice to Ahuramazdā if he were to partake in the cosmic order in afterlife. The king's law, which is reminiscent in the material world of the cosmic order that Ahuramazdā has fashioned in the height, that means in the yonder world, concerns the remaining constituents of the empire, the Homo Imperialis. There is a bifurcation between the two. In sum, the law of Ahuramazdā is about the Mazdean man, his happiness, his proper sacrifice, and his afterlife, his soul. The king's law seems, however, to project itself on the other constituents of the empire, maybe on the Homo Imperialis, beyond Persia. Both, however, Ahuramazda's law and the king's law appear to operate as ordering agents. In this, they are the different modi essendi of the self-same cosmic order, but for different audiences. The non-Mazdean man may reach happiness in this oneness, in his oneness with order, in the observance of the king's law. Blessedness, the state of transcendental oneness with cosmic order in afterlife, is, however, strictly reserved for the Mazdean man. As I said, this ordering within the empire could take different forms. Another piece of evidence is provided by the testimony of the book of Ezra. I am in no position whatsoever to express an independent opinion on the date or trappings of the Aramaic used in that book. But its essence may indeed be owed to the Judean Achaemenid administrative communities that served as cosmopolitan go-between for the empire and the priestly community of Jerusalem, as eloquently described by my colleague Bill Schlevin yesterday. The book of Ezra informs us that by virtue of a royal edict of Framana, whose historicity may be contested, a certain Ezra, whose existence may be contested again, a teacher well versed in the law of Moses, was dispatched in the 7th year of King Artaxerxes from Babylon together with his retinue, bestowed as he was with considerable means, that sounds quite Achaemenid, to revive the temple of Jerusalem. Ezra's mission as the king's emissary consisted in assembling the extent to which the law of Moses had been applied in Jerusalem, to appoint magistrates and judges to administer the Sephrim law, and to instruct forcefully those unaware of it, and finally punish those not complying to the law by which Ezra possessed. Of import in this context is the juxtaposition of the famous dictum, the law of Ezra's God, to the law of the king, subtly signaling that the canon which Ezra was required to impose upon the Judean communities in Jerusalem and its enforceability and validity were owed to the king's law, and was thereby sanctioned by the entire weight of the empire. Intriguingly, in this context, is the discovery of the same binary distribution we encountered in the inscriptions. That is, the strict division between the law of Ahuramazdā and that of the king, to be at work in this extraneous theology as well, in the garb of Yahweh's law being contrasted, albeit associated this time with that of the king. What does this mean? It means, or it might suggest, that what the empire intended to impress on the Judean community of Jerusalem was not an efflux of Iranian Mazdean beliefs, but a specific interpretation of Judean law itself, which on account of it being supported by the empire, had the authoritative potency of the king's law, thus intimating it had been regulated and put into order by the empire. What do we precisely mean with the Persians arranging or ordering Judean laws? And what type of imposition of imperial power is that? We certainly do not suggest that the Persian king or his scribes were intellectually engaged in the interpretative process of Jewish laws, but merely that the empire, having embraced as normative a set of laws, had acquiesced to its authoritative imposition on the communities of Jerusalem. The ordering thus was not the actual arrangement of any tradition, but its incorporation into the larger frame of Persian norms, ideology, and ultimately cosmogony. The Persian king of kings' fulfillment of Ahuramazda's divine design, his sanctioning of the law of Moses, was a reenactment of Ahuramazda's cosmic ordering, hence permitting the law of Moses to be interwoven into the larger fabric of Ahuramazda's orderly arrangements of the universe. Indeed, it seems that notwithstanding the disparity of religious beliefs and ritual practices, the Achaemenids would seek to domesticize these heterogeneous theologies and practices by casting them into the regulating framework of the empire's laws and mores, which on earth and for the Homo imperialis, the non-Mazdeans, were fulfilling the same function that the cosmic ordering of Ahuramazdā did in the world yonder, without either altering the essence of the religious cults or practices being ordered or being altered by it. Final example is to be provided, about which my graduate student, doctoral student, Hong Chen has brilliantly spoken yesterday. I shall, of course, await the result of his dissertation, and I'm not a specialist of Middle Egyptian, but I can utter a few, well, half-baked ideas about that. How about that? A similar pattern, at least he laughed, a similar pattern we may observe in the actions of the Persian kings in Egypt. Following the second conquest of Egypt, in 518 by Darius I, before on a rather remote but vast oasis on the west of the Nile, the Kharga Oasis, the Persian king Darius erected and completed a number of temples dedicated to Theban gods, and what is more, initiated extensive irrigation projects by introducing the so-called qanat system to the area. Although the substratum or the inner sanctum of some of these temples, especially those in Qasr Owaita, that's the Qasr Owaita, and further north, the Hibis temple, may go back to the Sayyid period, the bulk of the construction, in conjunction with a substantial qanat installation, identified the Kharga Oasis project as an Achaemenid imperial program. And the one responsible for it is Darius, whose cartouche is well attested on the walls of the Hibis temple, on many places, and on 2 occasions at the temple of Qasr Owaita, as you can see here. I owe this picture to my dear colleague Robert Rollinger, who just recently sent me this picture from Darius' cartouche at Qasr Owaita. At the Hibis temple, Darius is depicted on elaborate high reliefs as pharaoh, as we have just seen, sporting the fashionable Egyptian double crown. Striking in this context, of course, is not the Persian king's illustration as a pharaoh, but the extensive depiction of Egyptian gods to whom he pays homage. Although the temple is dedicated to the god Amun, the king nonetheless is represented making offerings to a myriad of Egyptian gods on 9 panels that have been drawn. So he is on the right side, and he's making offerings to the gods who are in sequence in front of him, including the Theban triad of Amun, Mut, Khonsu, neatly organized whenever applicable according to the regions whence the cult had originated. Altogether, the walls of the sanctuary bear the representation of some 700 divinities from Upper and Middle Egypt who partook in this pantheic festival. Beholding these reliefs, one may not escape the impression that this assembly of divinities represented yet another imperial project, signaling yet another modus of Persian ordering, this time not organizing the law of Moses, but the Egyptian pantheon. Again, this does not mean the Persians reorganized the cult of these divinities, altered their underlying beliefs or theophonic projections, but that the Persians, by dint of assembling these gods en bloc within a pantheic frame, had structured their relations with the king, incorporated them within the ideological frame of the empire, an empire that in essence pronounced order, a subtle imprint that symbolically was reminiscent of Ahuramazda's act of cosmic ordering. What is more, both in the case of the exiles returned to Jerusalem, which on the basis of ravages inflicted to the region of Yehuda by the Neo-Babylonians, still qualified under the early Thespids or Achaemenids as a post-collapse society, as has been persuasively interpreted more recently for the Benjamin region in Judea. And in the case of Kharga Oasis, the empire was investing substantially in barren land, erecting sanctuaries and temples as part of a yet to define building program. Surely this imperial engagement intended to pull the empire's hinterland into the empire's fold, but there is more. And that more seems to indicate the desire for the empire to impress its imprint on the realm of the divine of the empire's constituents by realizing in this world, in the phenomenal world, the notion of orderly excellence, the concept of fashion. From all that we may infer from the Persians of old, it appears that theirs was a system of governance which permitted a certain measure of individuation within the realm of the sacred, and that the beliefs of subject nations, although inevitably susceptible to some degree of acculturation within the Iranian element, were nonetheless allowed to remain and become culturally distinct. All this was possible because the projection of Achaemenid power upon the realm of the sacred was almost ideational, with the empire capturing the essence of the sacred and lending it a structural shell, which rendered its adoption, domestication within the grander scheme of Ahuramazda's cosmic ordering against the forces of chaos possible. This is a far cry from the practices we generally ascribed to the Mesopotamian world. It is an intellectual and subtle form of projecting imperial power, and it renders the task of discerning the imprint of the empire daunting. Maybe we could posit that what constituted the strength of the Iranian imperial project was its permissiveness towards distinct cultural expressions by actively fostering the agents of this individuality, thereby also strengthening the bonds of cohesion with the empire. But this in return may have also rendered the imprint of the Achaemenid civilization in history more elusive, which ought to be increasingly sought in the effects it produced, with the result that what outlasted the collapse of the Persian Empire was precisely the sum of cultural others it had allowed to flourish, and which, in the end, would outlive its fall. Thank you.